All right, are we on?
Yep.
Great. All right, well, welcome everybody. My name is Brian Meyer. I'm the co-director for the Midwest PBIS Network. And thank you for joining us for our keynote to kick off this week's virtual summer training series. We're really excited to have you. And I have some colleagues who are going to be assisting today as panelists to help with questions as they come in. Diane Lemaster and Katie Pullman will help with some technical assistance questions. And Patty is our tech guru, right, Patty?
I
Yeah,
try.
yeah. She's our constant researcher for all things Zoom. So she's assisting as well. All right. So anyway, it's great to have everybody here, and we're going to spend this hour getting oriented to the plan for this week, but then talking more specifically about returning to school after times of disruption and some new guidance that was just co-released by 5 national centers together and is posted on our center's website as well. So I'll walk you through some of those resources. Okay, I think you're probably all pretty comfortable with Zoom. You can, we do have a question and answer panel, and I'd like to encourage you to use that to ask questions as they come to you throughout the training. I'm sorry, throughout the keynote. And my panelists will help answer those questions, or I will too. Hopefully lots of great questions come in. We also have a chat box, which we can use too. So let's go ahead and get started here. So the plan for this week that you're registered for, Keynote to get organized right now, and then we're going to have afternoon sessions starting today at 12 o'clock. And then if you're also, or instead participating in a morning session, those will start on Tuesday, tomorrow at 8:30. These are all Central Standard Time. Some of you have elected to do both, which can make for some long days, a morning session and afternoon session, but we're excited about that. All right, this is where I'm going to pause and get organized a little bit. On your own, go ahead and take this quiz. Now, it's cheating because some of us have our names on camera right now. But see if you can think of the first name of each of the individuals here, and there's an extra credit point for knowing who our newest team member is, who's also in our attendees today as well. All right, I'll give you a minute. How many names do you know? All right, let's see what we got. So this is our team. And if you are wondering who the newest team member is, also one of our panelists, that's Trisha Schroed. And Trisha is wondering how I got her photo, but that's what the internet is for. So there we go. Trisha is joining as our research and evaluation director, and will be starting in August, but is helping to train some of the content this week as well. So we're really excited to have Trisha joining our team. As my colleague Amy on the screen says, we're a relatively small team, but we have a really big footprint in the work that we do nationally. So this is who we are. You can find out more about us on our website. But I know some of you are some super followers and you knew all this already, all these names. So thank you to my team. Really is the best group of people that anybody could work with. So let's get started by with a poll. All right, so I'd like to see where you are at right now. So I'm going to launch a poll right now and go ahead and take this. Let's see where you're at with your current knowledge of PBIS. All right, a few more people need to respond. All right. Diane, can you see the results, or do I have to end the poll to show the results?
No, you can see the results. You can see the percentages of each answer.
Okay, great. So nobody here is...
Brian, I do not. I think that actually maybe only you and Diane is supposed to see those. I cannot.
Okay.
All right, let's end the poll and see what happens.
End the poll.
There we go.
There you go.
Now you see it.
All right, great. All right, so this I would say is a fairly predictable response, and maybe what I was guessing, which is everybody here has some knowledge of PBIS. I think we have a lot of folks in the coaching role who are joining us today. One of the common questions, though, why people get engaged in our training institutes is because they know of PBIS, but it might be a homegrown knowledge, or it's been a while since they've received training, and they're not sure their understanding of it is still accurate, or maybe they're not sure if there's any misunderstanding they might have of it. A few of you, 3 of you, said that you know what it means to implement PBIS with fidelity, and then another 5 on top of that said that they can coach others. So that's a good understanding of where we're at. What we're going to focus on for today's content really does require a foundational understanding of PBIS. We're going to be talking about how to use PBIS to get ready for the return to school, and there's a little presumption of some knowledge with it. But if you're really more on the new side, and it's been a while since you've been trained, that's okay too. Just follow along and ask any questions, okay? All right. A couple more things before we get started with the content. We are planning a pretty comprehensive virtual training calendar for the year. We are trying to create an opportunity for any district or school teams that want to map out their PD plan, that they can do so looking through our virtual events. So I have 2 slides here showing the events. What you have here are sort of our standard team-based training, building capacity for the whole school. And then we have a significant amount of more content specific, where you can layer on additional knowledge of things such as bullying prevention, how that fits within the PBIS framework, for example. So just an idea on the slides about dates. We are currently scheduling August and September. They'll be on our website very soon, but we should have the entire calendar up, I'd say, in the next week or 2. Where are we? Middle of July. In about 2 weeks, we'll have the whole calendar up. All right. And finally, we have coaches networking meetings that traditionally we've done in person around the state in 9 locations. This year, we're going to hold them virtually, and we're going to encourage everybody from the state to join those networking meetings. They're free. It's a great opportunity to hear the latest messages on PBIS and to get some technical assistance. So we will host these. Here are the dates. They're going to be on Monday afternoons, 2 to 4 p.m. Central Standard Time. And we really encourage everybody to participate. We're hoping to get a great percent of coaches involved this year. Another save the date for your calendar, the National PBIS Leadership Forum, usually held in Chicago with about 2,000 people from around the country. This year is going to be virtual. It's only going to be $50 a person. That gets you all access to all 3 days of content. Our targeted audience are districts and state leadership teams, but we will have school representatives there as well. The keynote itself is going to be worth participating on. George Shugai has been a long-standing leader for the work of PBIS. He is really engaged right now in the Black Lives Matter movement and thinking, and he's going to talk about that and about equity, especially within the context of the PBIS framework. So make sure you save these dates. Registration will open about mid-August for that. All right. Let's thank and congratulate our Illinois schools for recognition. About 680 schools were recognized for their efforts last year, which is substantial considering such a disrupted year that we had. Their names are posted on our website as well. If your school was not recognized and you're still looking to do so, You can also go to our recognition pages and learn more about that process. All right. The slide deck that I'm using is available on our website. You can get to it by clicking on events and then the training institutes, and you'll see a little download link under the Summer Institute. Also, there will be our resources as well. So either follow along now or go ahead and download the PowerPoint if you want to make notes and use it yourself. All right, so here we are. What we're going to do today for the next 40 minutes is look at a publication that was produced on returning to school during and after crises, specifically a global pandemic in this case. And this was just updated a few weeks ago to help either state teams, district teams, school teams, or teachers, depending on which material you access, think about the return to school. All those resources are available on our website or on our national partners website under COVID-19 resources. You can get the full guide. It's very comprehensive. We thought a keynote here would be helpful to walk you through some of those key ideas. All right. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to move my screens around a little bit and let's go. First, let's find out what your plan is. So the question here is about your school, but if you're representing a district, maybe you could speak on behalf of your district. Some schools have different approaches, school by school within the district. So just from whatever your perspective is, where are you at? I'm going to turn the poll back on and let's use it again. So what is your plan for next school year? All right, we have about 20 more seconds here, waiting for the last 5 or so people to respond. All right, here we go. Half have not announced, which is quite remarkable considering we are a month away from many schools opening. Hybrid is a very common theme. I'm assuming most of our participants here are in the Midwest. I think in Illinois, I've been hearing all the districts around me where I live are doing some type of hybrid version. And then we have a couple people who are going to be all in person, a couple who are remote. One of the school districts in the suburbs of Chicago is having in-person for elementary students, and then hybrid for middle school and high school. The thinking being that elementary students both need supervision during the day when parents are working and need the most support in engaging in virtual learning. I think it's very interesting to see how schools are playing out. Knowing the decision that your school is making, now we need to decide where to go next. So what is the plan? So let's go ahead and use chat. What is on your mind about teaching this year? As you're thinking, whatever perspective you're from, district level, building administration, teacher, use chat. Put as many thoughts as you have, but just what comes to your mind when I say what's on your mind about teaching? What is preoccupying your thoughts right now as you're thinking about this return to school? Okay. So I'm going to start looking at some of these as they're coming in. How do I support students or motivate them in remote learning? That's actually the key word there from Caitlin, motivate during remote learning. The social emotional health of our students. How do we support them in this setting? You're just worried about what your district going to decide. I saw a comment from someone else, from Lisa, that the district said it could be any of these. We're still waiting to decide, which is not uncommon too. I think some districts are really playing it right now, day by day. I'm freaked out because we don't have a plan yet. Yep. Overwhelmed. There's a lot going on here. All right, if you've already responded, what else? Go one step deeper. What else is on your mind? Since the comments turned on, I think you can scroll through the comments, maybe so you can see them all. I believe they're on for everybody. And I'm just reading them. So first off, I appreciate some vulnerability here. I think lots of you are going a little bit deeper here and talking about a variety of concerns, mixed feelings. There's significant amount of anxiety. It's anxiety for ourselves, but it's anxiety for our responsibilities and for our students and for our colleagues or society. Anxiety about how we're being perceived as educators. Let me see if I can adjust the view. Allow attendees to chat with everybody. So we'll have to work on the chat, and let me share some examples. I'm not sure why only some come through. I believe these are sent to all I see it, all panelists. Give me 1 second here.
Maybe it needs to be all panelists and attendees.
Yeah. I think if somebody chatted and they send it to the panelists, then we get it. If you send it to panelists and attendees, everybody gets it. Let me share a little bit more, and I'll just go through a few quickly. People are frightened there's going to be a relapse, concern about safety. How do we support staff who aren't comfortable coming back to work? How it's going to impact the staff's mental health and the students' mental health. What are the needs of my very young students? How do they learn remotely? How do we continue structures around PBIS and social emotional learning? How do I teach when I have my own toddler at home? Frustration that that it's going to look like we're just winging it as educators, that there's not going to be a plan here. Needing to decide what to do and what not to do. How to provide PD for the staff. What should our framework look like? If you put your chat in and you send it just to panelists, if you want to copy and paste it again, you can send it to all panelists and attendees. That's how it goes to everybody. Now that I'm reading, I can see why I did it that way. Okay. So thank you again. I appreciate the vulnerability, appreciate the thoughts. Let's go back to the slides and we can think about just what's going on in the past 10 years and issues that we've confronted in education. I was looking last week for sort of a comprehensive list, and I really couldn't find anything. So I just sat down, and this is my free brainstorming for about 20 minutes of what's come up recently in education. And there's a lot here. And it probably doesn't even do it justice to everything that's really been going on. I do think it's interesting that I put vaping on here because it was just about 2 years ago where I had a assistant superintendent stand up in training and said, if you tell me that I can't suspend students for vaping, then I'm leaving this training. And the issue was, when is suspension and expulsion an appropriate response? That was the question, and they were just brainstorming it, but it got pretty energized. And I thought, vaping, 2 years ago, that was in everybody's mind, and it still is. It's still very relevant, yet looking front and center here, remote learning is going to preoccupy all of us, yet we're still responsible for everything else we see on here. So I think one of the questions that comes up in Illinois, a similar example came up with restraint and seclusion over the past year with some really important reports in the newspaper about inappropriate use of restraint and seclusion in education. And many times schools and districts want to run to, so what's going to be our plan? What are we going to do? What new thing will we use to address this need? Yet schools that are experienced in using the PBS framework understand that the framework itself is meant to respond to this constantly changing educational landscape. So I want you to lean into that idea. As we are thinking about returning to school during the pandemic, I don't think education could be any more complicated than it is right now. I think this is the pinnacle of the most complicated and most challenging efforts we have had as educators. I can't think of what has consumed all of us in the way that this pandemic has. Yet you want to come back to a system for moving forward and for structuring how you're going to organize your school, and that's what the PBS framework is. So organizing your school to achieve the outcomes through understanding the data, providing a continuum of supports for students or practices for students, and then supporting your staff through systems. Keep coming back to these 4 components. And no matter how simple you approach your PD plan for this year, if your team is asking itself about these components, it will guide your conversation. If you're in a position where your school says, you know what, we don't have time for PBS, we have to focus on remote learning, they're missing the entire point of a framework, and they're thinking of PBS as a program. Anybody who has that logic, you have to reverse it a little bit and say, so what is it? What are you thinking that PBS is? If you don't like PBS, what are you saying? Are you saying that we should not be using data for decision making? Or that we should try one thing for kids and it should work for everybody? Or that we don't have to provide support to our adults? Because at the core of this work, that's PBIS. Using data, using practices, and using systems to achieve the outcomes that you want. It might feel like there's a lot of systems that you've created that right now you might not have time for. but you still need to have systems that support adults. You have to decide what's the most important. Maybe you have data systems right now that are entirely based on in-person learning. We have to make those a little bit more efficient and think, okay, what are the data systems that are, what's the data we're gonna be looking at in our remote learning that's going to advise and guide us this next year? And then our practices. All of your practices, most of them are probably designed for in-person learning. What practices can we adopt and apply to a remote setting? What practices should we no longer do because they're inefficient or ineffective or they don't have a research base? It does require planning, and it requires a team to make those decisions that's representative of all the stakeholders, including the teachers. I think a lot of teachers right now feel like they're in the receiving end. They're waiting for their district to tell them what the plan is for next year. And we're probably not taking advantage of the collective problem solving when we have all the voices together. The PBS framework is adopted and implemented outside of schools as well. It's an organizational framework. And this was an example back in March before we were suggesting everybody wear face masks. So you don't even see face masks on here. But this is from a hospital in Massachusetts that quickly updated their hospital expectations using the PBS framework and then went about teaching that to everybody that was in the hospital. So respect, responsible, safety, and communication, expectations for the hospital. And this is what it looked like now at that start of the pandemic. If we can adopt it in a setting as complex as a hospital, we know it still has its usefulness and its necessity in complex organizations like schools. So to help experienced leadership teams, district, state, school leadership teams, think about those core questions. How do we use the PBS framework, what we know about the framework to move forward? Our National Center, in partnership with CISIP, the Institute for the Integrated Multi-Tiered System of Supports Network, the National Center on Improving Literacy, and the lead for the Literacy Center, collectively published this very comprehensive guide. It's so big that then they broke it down into some smaller parts. So a version for state teams, a version for district teams, and a version for school teams. We're going to focus today on the school version. And I pulled and extrapolated some key ideas out of there for our discussion so I can help you think about what's next. But if you're a district, if your role is at the district, or if you're a regional training and TA provider, look at maybe the state version or the district version accordingly. Okay, but all the links are here. The big idea is that we are restarting school. And restarting sometimes is after summer break, sometimes it's during any type of disruption. Restarting school is something we need to think about after there's been violence in our community or in our own schools. We even think about restarting it during natural breaks after over the winter holidays, for example. When we restart school, it's a responsibility for us to think about the effective, efficient, and relevant decision-making to guide our planning and implementation. This is what we know about restarting this year and the challenges that we're facing. It's not just disruption to school, it's disruption to our communities, disruption to our educators' families. We have teachers who are teaching and parenting at the same time. That is its own type of disruption. We have families who are out of work. Other challenges, gaps among our students are going to be more pronounced than before. Vulnerable students who we are intentionally focusing support on in our schools have had those supports delayed. Students with individual education plans may not have had those plans implemented consistently during remote learning. And there's a challenge to figure out how to do so, for example. We know the structure of school is going to be different. We know that relationships, which ultimately have one of the biggest impacts on the outcomes of our students, can be more challenging in both remote learning And then when you're in person and you're covered by a mask and you're engaged in social distancing. And finally, schools might be turning to new practices, thinking that's the solution, rather than emphasizing how do we teach teachers those practices, and what we implement, how do we check the fidelity of what we've done. So here is what we need to do in response to that. The first is focus on equitable outcomes. What are the outcomes you're expecting for your school right now? And in order to make sure those outcomes are equitable, we have to look at how are all of our groups performing toward those outcomes, and is it proportionate to the representation in school? Invest in your systems, which means focus on providing the PD and the support to teachers. Use your teaming structure, which we'll talk about more, to make the plan for your school for this year. When we talk about practices, the thinking should be focus on a small number of efficient and effective practices. We're going to have to be more focused in what we expect teachers to do to teach their academics, their social, emotional, and their behavioral supports. And then for data, we need to use what we've been doing all along, which is screening and progress monitoring, but making sure that we are looking at new data points, especially related to remote instruction. So I'm going to dig deeper into two pieces here, and we're going to go fast through some of these examples, but I want you to be thinking about questions. And then as I show the examples, we'll then pause, we'll use the Q&A panel, throw questions out there, and see what we can discuss, okay? The two pieces I'm going to dig into are your systems at the school, and then the idea on going back to basics on practices. So we'll probably try to spend about 10 minutes on each. When we talk about the systems for a school, what we're talking about is this organizational structure. And your school leadership team is that yellow circle in the middle. Your school leadership team, your tier 1 team, is responsible for these implementation functions to support students, families, community, and teachers. So how is your team structured? Does it need to be revised for the return to school after this disruption? And then what is the plan for training, coaching, and evaluation of your social, emotional, behavior, and academic instruction? And what are some demonstrations? What are examples and exemplars we have of teachers who are finding success that we can then capitalize on and share with others? So we're going to focus on, from the yellow circle on down, these systems and some thoughts you need to have about returning to school. The first one, a teaming structure. For those of you who are really experienced in PBIS, you might have a good idea for this necessary conversations logic. In your school, there's 4 teaming conversations. One is about tier 1 and the systems supporting all staff and students. There's a conversation about your tier 2 interventions. That's your tier 2 systems team. They monitor all of the layered interventions that are in place. There's a problem-solving team when we need to talk about individual students and understand the function of their behavior because they're not being met through our tier 1 and tier 2 supports. And then there's a tier 3 systems team that's monitoring all of the person-centered plans that are in place in the school. What we've updated for this graphic is to show that your tier 1 team traditionally focused on what are the supports for school-wide and class-wide, and now their responsibility has to include and what are remote learning supports as well, or hybrid learning. Your tier 2 systems team, the responsibility for that team is to say, what have we been doing for in-person layered supports for social, emotional, behavioral needs? That might be check in, check out, modifications to check in, check out, social, emotional, behavior instructional groups. And how will or should they adapt those for remote learning? What does check in, check out look like when your students are at home? Those are the core changes that we want to think about regarding the teaming structure. For your team itself, for your tier 1 team, focus on the first column. That's what I'll emphasize. And then you can think about these additional return, either what you're doing right now, what you're doing right when school starts, or what you're doing after school has been underway. Okay. And again, use the Q&A panel. Think about questions that might come up. So for your team, biggest considerations are who's on the team? Do we need to make changes? Do you have somebody with the behavioral expertise we need to be thinking about the mental health needs of our students, for example? Do we have tech represented on our team? Technology is going to be a key component of the systems that are supporting us right now. So who is our tech support, and are they a member of our tier 1 team? Do you have family voice represented? Do you have student voice represented, especially for high school teams? Those are essential to make sure that the ideas the tier 1 team has the social validity in your community. All right, so that's the first step. Who's on your team? That's the first thing. If you're going to write anything down today about next steps, that's the first question you're asking your schools. Who's making decisions? The next one is, when you meet, are you efficient and effective? Having a team and having the right people is the first step, but making sure that that team is focused on measuring, on choosing what's being implemented, and then progress monitoring the fidelity of that implementation is key. And far too often our teams are inefficient, that they're not using their minutes wisely. A couple different strategies, tips is one, and then plan, do, study, act out of our system partners is another, and the links are right here if you want to think about ways to organize your meetings. Finally, make sure that when you meet, you're prioritizing decision-making and action planning. Okay, this is step number 1, organizing, getting ready for our school teams to return to school. That team then oversees, I'm gonna go back to the graphic. So we have our team, their responsibility are these implementation functions, training, coaching, and evaluation. So let's look at those and ask, what are the key considerations? Your team should have a professional development plan. That's a plan for this next full calendar year. We help and work with districts all over the country, and it's very interesting to see districts who in August can say, here's my plan for the next 10 months, and to see for training and PD for our staff, and for us to see other examples of districts who say, we're not sure what we're training next week. So once you have your team set, and you talk about the efficiency of that team meeting, what's the PD plan? What are the practices we need to focus on? Train the key practices in our continuum. Think about your triangle of interventions and ask yourself, which of these practices are we continuing with? What training are we providing to our teachers to use those practices? And how will we make that training accessible? Short training, pre-recorded, accessible is probably going to be the key. Coaching. We can't expect to raise the collective knowledge of all of our educators in a building just through a traditional supervisory structure. A principal doing supervision, a couple observations a year, that is not sufficient for everybody to learn what they need to know when we come back to school after disruptions. We have to think about coaching more as a collective peer responsibility. So coaching should be coming from your leadership team to all of the staff. And in addition to remote coaching, I want you to always be thinking about peer-to-peer coaching. Teachers teaching teachers can be more meaningful and effective than using a traditional supervisory structure for learning. So think about coaching, flexible coaching options. There's a link right here on this slide. These links take you to some very deep learning, but again, you can go there if you want to look more at how coaching structures can be set up. Okay. The next one is evaluation. How are we going to know? How are we going to measure our school's success this year for social, emotional, behavior, and academic instruction? So have an evaluation plan. What are going to be the key data points? Are you looking at student engagement, for example, as a key data point? I'll ask that question in a little bit here. And what's the fidelity of your overall system? So maybe looking at using the tiered fidelity inventory and updating that. It's a fast process, but you're 15 minutes to 30 minutes for your team to complete. But then your coaches can use that and make some adjustments right away at the start of the year for what you need to focus on for implementing your PBS with fidelity. I want to point out in the second column here, when we're returning to school, again, focusing on equity, you have to make sure you're disaggregating your data, looking at race, gender, and disability. That's going to be essential to making sure that the most vulnerable students in our communities are getting a proportionate amount of support to see that their outcomes are equitable compared to the whole population. So a great link is right here to how to help you look at your data to address equity. And if you want to go deeper, I have a link here too that is a collection of equity resources that we have on our National Center's website as well. Equity is critical. That is going to be, the gap we know is growing and will grow day by day in our schools if we're not planning for it in advance and looking at what data can help guide our decisions for equitable outcomes. All right, and then the last piece for the overall systems view are relying on local demonstrations. From a school perspective, what are classroom or teacher-based examples when of staff who are using your practices effectively and getting those equitable outcomes? That's going to be the key as well. So your team is providing PD to the staff, and in doing so, you're asking the staff, what can you share back to your colleagues about some examples of what's working well? If we're trying check in, check out in a remote learning environment, quickly come back to your staff with, let's talk about some successes, what's going well. Not student by student successes, but system successes. How did you connect with a family who was not returning your communications? What was your approach for doing that, for example, for check in, check out? So using that local demonstration logic. Okay, so I see some in chat. Again, click on the Q&A in your Zoom panel and plug in any questions that you might have. Thinking about these core system components to your school and the prompts that we just provided, what comes to mind about enhancing your implementation functions for next year? All right, one question that was sent in chat, I'll go ahead and answer that one, is about parent engagement. Parent voice is just like I'm advocating that teachers are part of the decision-making of the school. Parents want to be making sure that their voice is represented as well. And when you have parents participating in your tier 1 team, they should be considered full equal members, meaning they should be getting the training as well for the work of the tier 1 team. They should be involved in providing the supports to the school and providing the coaching and thinking about how do we take this knowledge and distribute it to the rest of the parents as well. One of the advantages of having parents on teams is it prevents you from talking about individual families and individual kids and individual staff, which makes you be more efficient. There's nothing confidential in your tier 1 team conversations. So get that parent voice engaged so you can benefit from their perspective and to help you be more efficient in the way that you meet as well.
Brian, this is Katie. I was working on typing a response and struggling to say as much as I wanted, probably typing. And so what I would add to that is possibly, we usually say tier 1 teams meet once a month. Sometimes teams are meeting more often, and maybe as idea to think about for assigning responsibilities and organizing your teams might be some subcommittees. So sometimes we see teams that have like a teaching subcommittee. And so then, you might be able to kind of have those subcommittees that there's an action item. Our teams meet less often or less amount of time, because if there's a item around teaching, that subcommittee goes off to plan for the teaching component. And then a parent may or may not be part of that subcommittee, but their voice has been part of the identifying the problem and identifying what that will look like, but a smaller committee is working on that. So Jennifer, I was just thinking that might be kind of where your question was coming from, is your teams meeting often, and maybe if we think about some subcommittees or a kind of a lead for some different topics like data, teaching, communication, acknowledgements, that maybe our team has less time where they meet full and they kind of have some action items to work on it outside of team meetings.
Okay, thank you. A couple other questions that have come up. And let's go ahead and just answer these as they're coming in. So how do we get started? Because we're just beginning this process. So again, this guidance is focused on schools that have some experience with PBIS. The easiest way to get started with PBIS in general, I would say, would be go to pbis.org, look at the overview information for your team, and think about how do you organize how do you get a team together to start making decisions about the outcomes, data, systems, and practices of the school. So it always starts with teaming, which is what we started today's conversation with. And then from there, that team can be involved in saying, what do we need to learn next? Where do we go from here? Katie said we think about tier 1 teams meeting once a month, oftentimes. I would say that's probably in a progress monitoring mode as well, because this is really reorganizing the way a school is structured. Might be a lot of conversation that's needed for that. But these are all systems conversations that should help you be more efficient. So it's time well spent. And then that peer-to-peer coaching, that was the next question that was asked. It's interesting, some schools are very open to the idea of teachers observing teachers, like, hey, find a friend, partner with them, count your positive corrective ratios, and then reverse. And other schools are very resistant to that. So in general, if you're a school that is struggling with peer-to-peer supports, always start with asking for volunteers. Get that structure going. And when you volunteer, or if you're going to ask everybody to try it, say, find a colleague who you're comfortable with to observe your work, if you to observe their work. And that might be one way to get started until you can get some more formal structures are in place. Lisa, you're talking about the PD plan. Sometimes, so it's done. Sometimes, yes, we're talking about what type of external PD you might need, but I also want to think about PD really internally for the most part. What is the support that your team is providing to its own staff and students? That team might need to get PD from us or from other regional training providers, but the plan really should be focused on what's going on inside the building to distribute that knowledge. Okay. Hey, great questions. Let's talk about now practices. The other comment that was made in the guide was go back to the basics, do what works, and do it well. And really, if you have 40 different tier 1 practices in place right now, you kind of have to think, what are going to be the most essential ones? We can't train everybody on all of these all the time. We have to find room for training on distance learning practices as well. So the guide identified these 5 ideas for practices, starting with connecting. And what we're talking about here is in our tiered continuum of supports, what we're doing for all students. And now you can see we've updated tier 1 prevention to include school, classroom-wide, and a remote learning data systems practices for all students. Consider these 5 practices that are most likely going to achieve the success for your students in their social, emotional, behavior, and academic learning. These practices then can help inform what do we layer on for tier 2, what do we do more of, and what do we individualize for tier 3. So let's start with connecting. Relationships make the biggest difference. Students are going to be more engaged when they believe their teachers are their champion, when they're connected to their teachers. Communication is going to result in relationships. Having asset-based language, which means strength-based. So instead of talking about what your students aren't, what they can't do, think about what skills they have and always build up. So have that strength base when you're thinking about your students. A couple examples of a way to quickly implement this in person is use positive greetings at the door. That's a very popular but also well-researched strategy. If you greet students and welcome them at the start of instruction, they're more likely to be engaged. And then under remote learning, that can be modified in a remote learning environment as well. Asking each student, hey, tell me something about yourself in chat. It's great to see you. Let me ask this question. Though, I'm sorry, I jumped ahead of myself. So that's connecting. Basic, what's the strategy? Whatever, if we're going to implement positive greetings at the door, positive greetings at login, the tier 1 team's job now is to train the staff on how to do that and then to monitor. Are we doing it like we said we would? Okay, that's the job of the tier 1 team. Screening is the next step, and that practice is going to allow you to identify are getting equitable outcomes and which students need more support in what areas. So one way we do that might be through a social emotional behavior screener. That's a district level decision. And we have a great resource that you can click on there to learn more about that at the district level. Once a screener is selected, or if you're going to use informal screening, the teacher's job then is to use that screener within the first few weeks of school. And for the school to adapt that screener, whether it's going to be in person or remote. Let me give you an example of informal screening. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and open up a poll. During remote instruction last year, March, April, May, what % of your students continued and maintained and fully participated in their instruction when they were engaged in virtual learning? Okay, about 10 more seconds here. All right, I'm going to go ahead and post. I think we got just about everybody who's responded. Here we go. Let's add them up. So if you take B, C, and D together, everybody responded. It was 80% or less, except for one person. Half of you said 40 to 60%, quarter of you said less than 40%. I was informally asking teachers, and I was regularly hearing 20%. 20% of my students are actively engaged. High school especially, math teacher right across the street from me, 2 out of his 30 students were still engaged in May. Okay. Screening. This is This is a key question, and what you can see is what used to might be a tier 2 or a tier 3 focus area in your school is now immediately tier 1. Student engagement and remote instruction may be the most important outcome we need to measure, and our practices should be targeted at, okay, how do we get this back above 80%? Because if students aren't engaged, they're not learning, and that's the responsibility of our schools. So that might be family supports, that might be modifying check-in, check-out, but you have to think, what are those strategies going to be? That's, again, an example of screening, looking at quick data, making decisions. After screening, the next step would be providing support. So if we know that in remote learning, our students are less engaged, what are going to be the supports that are going to directly impact that? And this is not a place for us as a TA provider to tell you the supports, but this is the point of your tier 1 team. How can we increase our student engagement in remote learning? What does that look like? We should all know that it's not going to be punishing students into compliance. Obviously, that's not going to work. It's going to be probably relying on relationships, building up skills, direct instruction, communicating with those students in an intentional way, and then continuing to progress monitor. So we go from supporting, now we teach. If you haven't adapted your behavior matrix yet, that's going to be one of your immediate priorities, because what we've just screened for, what we learned is students are not engaged. We're thinking about, okay, so how are we going to support those students? And one of the first components of support is going to be making our expectations clear and teaching students how to follow those expectations. So here's an example of a modified matrix, whether you're in person, in the hallway, classroom, or on the bus, or whether you're online in your group work or independent online. What can it look like? Having clear expectations and clear routines. We have other examples where we can teach families how to make their own matrix, and we've shared this before. You can find this on our website as well, so I'm not going to go into it more here. After you've set your expectations, the next step would be to teach. And what we're really saying is, what in your matrix are you going to be instructing on? How does it connect to your academics? And you should be doing that during all of your instruction. So an example of teaching is explicitly stating both the academic objective and the social, emotional, behavioral objective at the start of every lesson. So this is an in-person example, but if we're going to do it online, it might be the same. Hey, this morning during our lesson, we're focusing on understanding number properties. Perhaps focusing on work is not going to be the best online behavior that we need to see. But you might come up with what does it mean to be responsible and what we're going to be monitoring for then. And then the last piece is monitor, and that's the cycle. So these are the practices, and monitor be looking at that data, looking at data for both in-person learning and remote learning. There's a great link here for some virtual progress monitoring ideas and how you can look at your data and, again, assess for those equitable outcomes. So we're here at 10 o'clock. I'd like to stay on just for a few more minutes if it's okay. Please go ahead and use the question and answer. Put some more questions out there. I'll ask Diane and Katie to help respond to these as well. What comes to mind when you think about these core practices? And as a school team, deciding what would be probably the simplest and most efficient practice we could do for each of these to ensure we're getting the outcomes for our students this year. Now, just wait one more minute. Sort of the questions might come up. Oh, Jennifer, you're very welcome. I'll answer that one live. Those are good examples. We have lots of them on the website. Look at that resource. And then Katie Pullman recorded a great webinar on how to help families make their own at-home matrices. So you can see that one as well on our website. Jennifer identified the 5-to-1 positive to corrective ratio. So that's that asset-based thinking for our teachers, focusing on their strengths. So how do we encourage it? So I would say you encourage it by first teaching teachers what it is. So come up with your own 10 to 15-minute explanation of why we want a 5-to-1 ratio, why it's important to be strength-based with our students. Teach them examples of what that is. But then that peer-to-peer monitoring of 5-to-1 really makes a difference. Some of your teachers might already have built up their skills in this area. You can always talk to students and first talk about their strengths. So you could use exemplars as well. But if teachers aren't actually checking their data on their ratio, then there's no way they're going to be at 5-to-1. They're going to be lucky if they're at a 1-to-1. As humans, we're wired to see what's not right in a situation. So we have to train ourselves to respond with yes and respond positively to whatever challenge we see, and to be selective then when we're providing that correction. There is, oh, yes, there's a place for those corrections. That 5-to-1. There should be that one, but we have to be selective in it. If all we're ever doing is correcting students, we're not building the relationship, we're not focusing on their strengths, meeting them where they're at. So that's the rationale for it. If you look on our website under Tier 1 team training and teaching expectations, section 1.4, we talk more about some examples on the 5-to-1 ratio and maybe some ideas on how to try to address that. Bottom line, use the PBES framework, focus on the system and those practices like we talked about today. Those kind of bled into the data a little bit, so I think you should have seen those examples. What we know, if your school continues to rely on the PBES framework, when you compare, and you're doing it with fidelity, when you compare your school to other schools that are just like yours, these are the differences you should see. We increase our student outcomes, we reduce exclusionary discipline issues, and we improve outcomes for our teachers. A well-organized school focusing on its outcomes, data, systems, and practices compared to schools that are not structured in that way, maybe just going topic by topic by topic, for example. These are the types of differences that you should see, okay? A couple great links in this slide as well that can go to the research if you want to dig deeper. And these are being updated by our center as well. They would have been published already, but a pandemic got in the way. But examining the evidence base for school-wide behavior support is a great place to start if you're at the very beginning of this conversation and coming up with the rationales for why we should structure schools this way. All right. Hey, everybody, different ways to follow us. This presentation might be on our YouTube. I'm not sure. I think we talked about doing that. So you'll probably see that later. And you could also share it with others if you want. Also follow us on our social media. This is what your event looks like for the rest of the week. Thank you for jumping on this keynote. I hope these resources were helpful to you. I know that you have a lot of work to do because that's what schools are. It's a lot of work, but we're here to help. So thanks again. Have a great week. I'll be in some of these trainings myself, and I'll see some of you then. Thanks, Katie, Diane, Patty. Appreciate everybody jumping in and helping out with the panel as well. Have a great day, everybody.